What do you think will happen when we start shooting Russian fighter jets out of the sky above Ukraine? This is not a pithy question. When Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the United States Congress, he asked, his biggest ask was for a no-fly zone, for the United States to help enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And I don't understand what Zelensky's doing. My evolution of thought on what's happening in Russia and Ukraine has reached somewhat of a crucial point here, because I don't understand how Zelensky can sit before the United States Congress and ask for a no-fly zone, understanding what the implications of a no-fly zone will be. And so this question, and I also don't understand, by the way, how all of our politicians, our elected representatives in Congress, aren't asking this question. This should be the first question that any politician, any pundit, anybody weighing in on Russia and Ukraine, let alone the decision makers who are actually in charge of making choices like this, making policy, why this isn't the first question. What would happen? What do you think will happen if the United States starts shooting Russian planes out of the sky? This is a very elementary question. It's a very basic question. It's a very important question. What would happen if we start shooting Russian planes out of the sky? Actually, let me back up. The humanitarian no-fly zone that Zelensky is calling for, the word humanitarian is completely arbitrary. We already know it's a humanitarian disaster in Ukraine. We can ask these questions while acknowledging that Vladimir Putin is evil, that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely wrong, and that Ukraine has every right in the world to defend their country, their self-determination, and their borders. All of these things can be true at once. But a humanitarian no-fly zone, the word humanitarian is completely arbitrary to what this is. Whether it's called a humanitarian fly zone or whether it is just called a no-fly zone makes no difference, because the what it is of a no-fly zone remains the same. A no-fly zone would be a statement by either Ukraine or the United States or NATO, or I guess Zelensky is proposing some kind of new international alliance outside of NATO, which would essentially be the same thing as NATO, all these different countries coming to Ukraine's defense and helping them fight this fight. But the no-fly zone would be a prohibition, an announcement of a prohibition of any Russian aircraft in Ukrainian airspace. So what happens when Russia violates this verbal prohibition? Well, it means nothing, of course, unless there's an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism can't be sanctions. It can't be a verbal slap on the wrist. It can't be some other kind of diplomatic penalty, because we've already done those things. No, the enforcement mechanism of a no-fly zone would be whoever is in charge of enforcing this no-fly zone would shoot down Russian aircraft. So Zelensky is asking the United States Congress to help Ukraine, or to put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which means that the United States would be drawn into the enforcement of this no-fly zone, which means if Vladimir Putin and the Russians encroach on this no-fly zone, what does he want? What does Zelensky want? The United States to shoot down Russian planes? This is the only way to enforce a no-fly zone. Otherwise, it means nothing. So if the United States then enforces a no-fly zone by shooting down Russian planes, then what happens? Well, then the United States has become one of the aggressors in this war. We've become a party to this war. This then escalates the entire situation between Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, drawing in perhaps NATO, but definitely the United States. Like I said, it depends on if this is a UN no-fly zone or a NATO no-fly zone or a US no-fly zone. Whoever the enforcer is, the United States is now involved in this war, and that's exactly what we don't want. And so this is where I start to become skeptical of Zelensky himself and what he's asking for. Because the rundown, what I'm talking about right now, the what it is of a no-fly zone, how it's enforced, and what the implications of the enforcement are, this does not take some expert in foreign policy to understand the implications. This is just the basic understanding of a no-fly zone. Basically, everyone knows that this is how a no-fly zone works. So if Zelensky is asking for this no-fly zone, but since he is asking for this, he must understand the implications of this. So my question for him is, how is it in the interest of your country to start a conflict between the United States and Russia. Because there was a time, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, where Zelensky was asking for things from the United States that the United States, it wasn't proper for the United States to respond according to his demands. You know, we didn't want to be drawn into this conflict between Putin and Ukraine. But I understood why Zelensky was making those asks, because they were in the interest of his country. It just wasn't in our interest, the interest of our country, to respond to those requests. Well, now the situation has changed. I don't even understand the interest, Zelensky's interest in a no-fly zone, because it's not in the interest of his country to see an escalation, because an escalation between Vladimir Putin and NATO or Vladimir Putin and the United States is going to lead to nuclear war. So how is that in the interest of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people who are being victimized right now by Putin? How is it in their interest to face a potential nuclear war if the United States or NATO gets involved here? And there's actually one more part to this too. So Zelensky himself, when he made this request to the United States Congress, this is what he said. Listen to his words. It's through a translator because this part of his speech, he was not speaking in English. But listen to how he paints this no-fly zone. It's actually very critical to our understanding of his ask. Take a listen.
Now, when you need it right now, when we need you right now, remember Pearl Harbor, terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when your sky was black from the planes attacking you. Just remember it. Remember September the 11th, a terrible day in 2001 when evil tried to turn your cities, independent territories, in battlefields, when innocent people were attacked from air. Yes. Just like no one else expected it. You could not stop it. Our country experiences the same every day, right now, at this moment, every night, for 3 weeks now. Various Ukrainian cities, Odessa and Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Sumy, Zhytomyr and Lviv, Mariupol and Dnipro. Russia has turned the Ukrainian sky into a source of death for thousands of people. Russian troops have already fired nearly 1,000 missiles at Ukraine, countless bombs. They use drones to kill us with precision. This is a terror that Europe has not seen for 80 years, and we are asking for a reply, for an answer to this terror from the whole world. Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine, to save people? Is this too much to ask? Humanitarian no-fly zone, something that Russia would not be able to terrorize our free cities. If this is too much to ask, we offer an alternative. You know what kind of defense systems we need, S-300 and other similar systems. You know how much depends on the battlefield, on the ability to use aircraft, powerful, strong air aviation to protect our people.
Okay, so Zelensky painted what's happening in Ukraine, which is horrific. It's awful. There's death and carnage everywhere. He's painting this. He's trying to gin up the emotion in the American people and the American Congress that we felt after Pearl Harbor, that we felt after 9/11. And the reason that he used those two incidents is not just because those two incidents were some of the most horrific carnage that we have seen here in the United States. They were attacks on our soil by hostile foreign entities. The reason that he used those two examples was because those were attacks from the sky. Those were attacks waged from airspace. And so the reason that he's giving those two examples is because he's saying we're facing that same sort of assault from the sky, hence our need for a no-fly zone. But when I heard this blew my mind, because I said, okay, so Zelensky is acknowledging that this war is primarily being fought by the Russians from the sky. He's asking the United States for a no-fly zone, meaning he wants us to enforce it, meaning he wants us to shoot down Russian planes, meaning what does this mean? What is he actually asking for then? He's asking for the United States to fight this war for the Ukrainians. And that, my friends, blew my mind.